Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, truly, to be here. I've never been to Israel before, and it's a treat. You can't hear? Is that better? Is that better? Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very grateful to the Trump Foundation, and it's humbling to be here, and to learn from you. I can certainly share, and I plan to, what my experience has been in this arena, this important arena. But I know too that by the end of the day, I can hold it, it's good. By the end of today, and of course on Wednesday, I will be richer for being here. So thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is share with you what my own experience has been in the area of defining, of understanding what good teaching is, and then using that understanding to improve it. And I do think also that Eli's introduction to the morning and his reminder to us all of how complex this work of teaching is an important place to begin, because it is enormously complex. It's not like standing in an assembly line in a factory and putting on the widgets. It's very, very complex human endeavor. And every day is different. We all know this. And so the challenge, is of course, to modify, to change if we have to improve what we do as teachers to affect better outcomes. So my own experience with this began, and by the way, my primary contribution to the effort has been in the writing and then in the development of further resources around what came to be called the framework for teaching. But it began, in terms of the history, well, let me start. We know that there are many factors that contribute to student learning. And a rigorous and appropriate curriculum, resources for teachers and students, organizational structures in the school, and overwhelmingly, the quality of the teaching, the quality of the instruction. It is the single most important one. There are others, the others are there, as well as factors outside of the school altogether. But the single most important one is the quality of the teaching. And so that then leads one to the very next question, which is, well, what is that? We can't begin to improve the quality of teaching if we've not defined it. And that's the starting point of my work. We can't improve it if we haven't defined it. So how do we define it? My own work in this area began in a few projects in the United States that I was a part of. The first one had to do, was called Praxis 3, Classroom Performance Assessments. This was an effort at Educational Testing Service, and that is, you may know ETS, they produce and provide materials for state departments of education in the United States. We have, as you may know, we have 50 states, and that means we have 50 systems of teaching and of instruction and of schooling. 50 systems of education. Every one of them is obliged to ensure, or to try to ensure, that every teacher teaches at a high standard. And so Educational Testing Service provides for states, and there are a few other companies who do the same, but they do for many states the mechanisms to ensure that teachers are of high quality. One part of that had to do with observers of teachers who had earned their degree and had their first job to ensure that they were good and good enough. And so that's what the Praxis 3 project was, and it involved trained observers to observe in the classrooms of first-year teachers and to then comment on their quality to the state to ensure that they were good. First-year teachers based on observation. The second project was the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, which was designed and is designed and does learn about the teaching of experienced and accomplished teachers for the purpose of advancement in their career. And it's a rigorous process. It involves teachers submitting evidence of their teaching through videotape and artifacts, and those submissions being judged, assessed by trained assessors. The reason I'm telling you this story is that these were both assessment systems, one for first-year teachers, one for experienced teachers. And yet, everyone who touched these systems, whether as designers, as candidates, as assessors, as practitioners, everyone said, I've become a better teacher. Everyone. I've become a better teacher because of the experience of doing these. And as I looked at these, I was involved in both. I was the only person at Educational Testing Service who was involved in both, which means I was the only person on the planet involved in both. And I noticed that the one thing they had in common was clear standards of practice. They were different from each other, mind you, because they had very different purposes. One for very first-year teachers, another for highly experienced teachers. But they had them. And they had some common underlying sort of visions of what good teaching and of course what learning was for students. So it wasn't hard for me to say, well, if this is good for first-year teachers, if this is good for highly accomplished teachers, what about everyone else? What about all the other teachers, the other 90% of teachers somewhere else in their career? Would they not also benefit from clear standards of practice? So that's what I set about to do. And I wrote this thing called the Framework for Teaching. Now, I would just start off, and we're not going to spend time here. If we were in a workshop, we would spend time here, but this is a conversation we engage in. If you were to walk into a classroom, what might you see or hear there from the students as well as the teacher that would cause you to think you were in the presence of an expert? What would cause you to think, oh, this is good. If I had a child this age, I'd want them here. I'd want them in this class. Okay? Think about it for 30 seconds. And somebody say, what came to your mind? Anybody?
Self-confidence and engagement.
Confidence and engagement, what a wonderful one to start with. Now, I'm going to guess that when you say engagement, you don't just mean busy. No, exactly. And on both sides. That's wonderful. Okay. It's exactly ideas like that and the research behind them all over years that then led to the Framework for Teaching. And it has 4 big domains, as you can see, 4 big domains of relatively equal size: planning and preparation, the classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. Each of them is divided into either 5 or 6 smaller components, as you can see. And so if we had carried on the conversation I just began with the question about what would you see or hear in a classroom, we would generate in a group of this size almost everything that's here. And so that's why it represents not only the research, but the wisdom of practice. Now, it's not the only such model, of course, and the Rama here has very similar attributes, but the importance is that there is shared understanding of what these things mean. Now, this framework is grounded in some assumptions, both about learning, how students learn, and about teaching. And I'll just say a few words about this. The fundamental idea about student learning is, and it almost sounds trivial to say it, and yet I think one must, which is that learning is done by the learner through an active intellectual process. Well, that's right. That is, the learning by the students is not something the teacher does. The teacher causes the learning through designing learning activities, explanations, and so on, that activate the student's own thinking, an own seeing of connections, and based on Eli's story earlier, that may be quite different for different individuals. This is why it's an art as well as a science, and why it's so complex. So, which then leads me to the fundamental assumption about teaching that underlies this framework, which is that teaching involves complex decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. I mean, it is a true profession. That is a definition of a profession. So it's not just following the routines or doing what the book says or even what one's professor said. It is changing every day, every moment, based on judgment. In other words, teaching is a thinking person's job. It's not routinized. It can't be. It's much too complex for that. And it's thinking in all these different ways. Now, these aspects of teaching are themselves related to one another. That is, you can take any one, let's say questioning and discussion techniques, which is the second one under instruction, a powerful instructional technique. If a teacher were very skilled at that, you can ask, well, what else would that same teacher have to be good at also? Well, they'd have to know their subject, the very top of planning and preparation. They'd have to know their students. What's an appropriate question, appropriately difficult question for this group or this individual? They'd have to have clear outcomes. What do I want the students to learn from this discussion? They'd have to have, over in the classroom environment, an environment of respect where students know it's a safe place to take a risk. There would be routines and procedures. Do you raise your hand or do you not? And so on, right? And so these aspects of teaching are intertwined. And so then you might say, well, then why do we list them all out separately? What's that about? And here's my answer to that. I think of a theater in the round. If you think of a theater in the round, you have a play, of course. That's like the teaching. That's the lesson. It's a theater in the round, so the audience is sitting all around. Because the audience is sitting all around, the lights have to come from all directions. I think of these aspects of teaching like the lights. It's like the lights. Here we have a lesson. It could be strengthened. It could be better. But how? So we look at the lights. So that way, in that way then, this framework and any such document serves then as an analytic tool to understand practice. That's its value for learning, for professional learning. It has, of course, been used for evaluation. That's not its most powerful use. And in the US, we are in the moment, and you don't have to care about this, fortunately. We are in the throes of accountability and so on for schools. So that's been driving a great deal of what I've had to do. But that's not what I care most about. What I care most about is the power of teacher reflection, professional conversation, teacher self-assessment to influence learning. Because, I mean, it wouldn't matter if this was easy work. It's not easy work. That's why it's so important. And to use then tools, and the other thing to say is that teaching is also very demanding work in terms of the time. And so people don't have a lot of time. And they can't afford to spend time doing things that aren't productive in terms of improving practice. So it has to be efficient, right? So that's the motivating force behind the work I do. Now, some people look at this and they think, well, this is all very well, this is quite good, but you know, it's not complete, they'll say. They'll say, well, where's technology, for instance? Well, there are a few things that I call common themes, and here's what they are. Equity, cultural sensitivity, high expectations, developmental appropriateness, accommodating individual needs, appropriate use of technology, student assumption of responsibility. These are common themes. They are not components of teaching. These are the components. These themes are not components, not because they're not important, they are, but because they do not describe the work of teaching. The components describe what teachers do. The common themes describe the manner in which they do what they do. So, for example, let's take the technology. The use of technology is not something important in itself. It's important because it can advance some other aspect of teaching. So the question one asks then is, in which of these aspects of teaching would the appropriate use of technology improve it? And how? And that is a large part of what we do in training, is helping people understand these interactions and to therefore have a more powerful model. So you can look through them and think. It wouldn't be all of them, but it would be a number that would all be strengthened by the use of technology, or a concern for equity, or for cultural awareness, and so on. Okay, so, and the other thing I will say about these is that each of these components is accompanied not only by a description, a narrative description, but also a rubric. And this is then the tool. This happens to be the one for establishing an environment of respect and rapport, where students feel safe, where they are respectful to one another as well as the teacher to them and they to the teacher and so on. And so the levels of performance reflect the increasing skill and experience and expertise of a teacher. And they describe, now often the evidence for the teacher's skill is what the students do. Because I define teaching as that which causes learning. And often the evidence for that is, of course, the students. And so each of them, and I noticed in your model, your Rama model, you have the same thing. Now, what I have discovered, and I'm wondering, and it'd be interesting to have a conversation about this, whether this has been your experience as well. What I discovered was that it wasn't enough to write it down, and even to write it down and have conversations with people, because it had to evolve. The framework itself has had to evolve in ways that were demanded by the research. But let me just mention that the framework itself has these sort of features to it. It's comprehensive, trying to describe all of the complex work. It's research-based, means there's a solid body of research behind everything in it. It is validated. That is a very important thing to be able to say, because it has been part of some large and independently organized research studies that have found that high levels of teacher performance on the rubric, on this rubric, there's high levels on the rubric, are predictive of high levels of student learning as assessed by assessments of them. That's an important thing to be able to say. Otherwise, you don't know whether the practices you're encouraging are the right ones. And so that is an important thing to be able to say. It's, of course, generic. There's one framework for all settings, whether it's early childhood or high school physics or middle school language. It means, though, of course, that the manner in which teachers do these things at different levels is different, but the underlying construct is the same. And I try to describe the underlying construct. But this also then suggests work that I can imagine people in this room would be wanting to do for whatever you use as your foundational instrument, in the sense that the details of how a teacher does and affects the different aspects of teaching will certainly be different in a physics class from in a kindergarten class. Of course, they should be. They should be. But then what are they? And that is work that I'm only now beginning to embark on. And so I'm looking so forward to the conversations we'll have today and then in future days, because I'm sure you can help offer insights for me. I mean, this is a very important piece of learning that I'm engaged in. And then, of course, it's independent of any particular teaching methodology. It's silent. It's agnostic on how one should teach. It is, though, about teaching to ensure learning. And that, of course, you know by watching the students and by whatever assessments you do of them. This is a slide that just shows the validation that I was mentioning. I'll be very brief. This was a large study in the city of Chicago with 100 schools. And it shows for the lowest levels of, this was the correlation of teacher performance with student learning on a student assessment. And the 4 sets of bars represent the 4 levels of performance: unsatisfactory, basic, proficient, distinguished, with the 0 line being the norm of what you would expect in a year's schooling for student learning. And so you can see that at the unsatisfactory level, they weren't close. In fact, they were well under the expectation for a year, and so on. And it's not until teacher performance is at the highest level that you actually see good learning, high levels of learning, which has only made me realize that it's even more important than I thought before, that we help teachers move from one level to the next level. That becomes essential. So, of course, the framework is used in all these different settings. And let me just say one other thing here. It's not sufficient, of course, to be able to know which level of performance a teacher is. That's a sort of an assessment challenge. The challenge is to help them get better, to help adequate teachers be really good and good teachers be great. And one of the things we also know about teacher learning is a lot of that learning and motivation for that learning comes from them, of course, because they're learning. And it's complex work, and so we have to help. Then that means government structures, school structures, to promote that learning. And so, of course, the framework is used in all these different ways, and teacher preparation, etc., supervising student teachers, recruitment and hiring, mentoring, structuring professional development, and then, of course, for evaluating teacher performance. That last, in the US at least, has consumed a lot of energy, but it's not, in my view, the most important at all. Not at all. But I have to be honest and say it has resulted in that. The framework itself has evolved. It was first published in 1996, and then a second edition was published in 2007. A third version, I will call it, because we needed tools to evaluate teachers, we tightened the language, wrote some critical attributes of the different levels, and offered examples of practice at each of the levels. And that has since been superseded even by a version in 2013, just now. All of these share the exact same architecture that I showed you at the beginning, about the 4 domains and the 22 components and the elements in them and so on. That is the same. That has not changed. What has changed is it's gotten better, I hope. But no, I think it has got better because we've learned to be more precise. And you'll hear in a few moments about some of the projects that I've been involved with that demanded precision of language. Demanded precision of language. Otherwise, we didn't know what we had. And so that has spurred the evolution of the framework itself to being a more precise instrument for all of the purposes. That is, whether it's self-assessment, reflection, conversation with colleagues, supervising of student teachers, mentoring of new teachers, all of it depends on being accurate in the assessment of how good practice is now, right? So just to reiterate this point of why are we doing this? Why is it important to have clear standards of practice, a clear framework, if you like? It is, first of all, to be able to ascertain with some certainty what the level of teaching is at any moment, for the purpose, though, of improving it. That's the reason we do this. And as I said at the very beginning, we can't begin to do that if we've not defined what it is, with some clarity and precision. And what has been gratifying to me, of course, is that when my book was first published in 1996, I started getting emails and phone calls and even letters. I don't know if you remember letters. We used to do letters, right? From all over the world. Mostly in the US, naturally, but not only. People saying, thank you, thank you. Now I can do my work, whatever that work was. And for teachers, it was, now I can understand my teaching. And so the having of a clear framework and the using of it turns out, now I did not know this. This turned out to be a surprise to me, actually. I mean, I have no idea what truly motivated me to spend all that time writing that book, but I'm very glad I did now because it's so gratifying to have it be so appreciated. And oh, just as a little bit of background, it was taken. It was published by a big organization, a big membership organization called ASCD in the U.S. They publish a lot of books, and they send, I think, 6 a year or 4 a year to their members. And so that means they have to have some books to send. They chose mine as the book to send to all their members, which was 100,000 people, which sort of got it on the street. And it could have died then, of course, but because it just turned out to be useful, and that's what's gratifying to me, it turned out to be useful for teachers, for professors of teacher education, for mentors and coaches, for school heads. It turned out to be useful. And that's, of course, been gratifying. But it turned out to be useful because it helps do this. It helps do the shift. So I'll just say a few more things here. These, oh, you can't even read those, I don't think. Can you read them? No. Well, let me just say that these little bubbles represent all the things that happen in schools around teaching, right? I can read them here. There's supervision of student teachers, there's mentoring of new teachers, there's recruitment and hiring, there's professional development, there's teacher evaluation and so on. These are all, in most places, quite distinct from one another. They can be unified by a single definition of practice, my personal favorite being my framework, of course, but it's not the only one. But the key is that they are all informed by a single definition. What's happening here? Oh, sorry, hang on. They are all then informed by a single definition so that they then reinforce one another. So that when there are new teachers come to a school, for example, they are being mentored by the same vision of practice that is being used in the professional development offerings or in their mentoring and coaching and so on. And so the point is simply that not only do these things happen, you want to have them not happen independently of one another. That's really the key. And so I will just close by saying that any framework for teaching, including mine, we've noticed this, but any framework for teaching confers these benefits on the users. The first one, of course, being common language. Common language. Every profession has its language, and education tends not to, or ill-defined language. And the language then permits the development of shared understanding of practice. It's hard to overstate the importance of this because it's so real. And then, of course, that permits self-assessment and reflection on practice, and it also permits structured professional conversation to enhance practice. So these are I have no idea how I'm doing for time, but it looks like, I hope it's about the right amount of time. Because here we are. Is it just about right? Okay, good. So I would like to close. I think we're going to shift over and you'll have an opportunity to hear from Mark. But I don't know if we want to pause for conversation now or should we wait?
I think we should do it
After Mark. Okay, good. Then I'll turn this back over to you then to introduce my colleague. Thank you so much.